to get the deficit down and solve the problem, and let Graham-Rudman have some moral force. But you could spend a lot of energy trying to put teeth back in this peculiar procedure.
Thank you very much. Mark Andrews, a special welcome to you. The reason that Mark Andrews is so valuable to a panel like this is that he spent 17 years of his life on the House side as an appropriator. He spent 6 years of his life on the Senate side as a budgeteer and also as an appropriator. So he brings a lot of experience, a lot of institutional memory to this panel, and we want to make a special welcome to him. One of the first questions that was directed to him is, why is Congress continue to jaywalk across the budget process? Why does it ignore the red lights of deadlines that it's set up for itself?
Probably because Congress is a creature of the American people, and the American public hasn't gotten it in their mindset yet, the tragic consequences of the deficit spending that we've been going on and on and on with. We talked for a minute about farm programs. Really, the only reason we're spending $27 billion this year for a farm program is because interest rates are so high, and because of the deficit the government's borrowing in competition with the farmers, as well as the small business people, driving their cost of operation up. If interest rates were down where they ought to be in relationship to inflation, Dr. Rivlin pointed out quite correctly that interest rates are higher now than they have ever been. When interest rates were 19%, they weren't as high as they are today, because in relationship to inflation, they were much lower, and farmers got along fairly well. Now, because farming is the most capital-intensive business in this country, because of the deficit, farmers are pushed into a non-cash flow situation, and we end up spending $27 billion to try to bail them out. We just had some discussion about the cost of interest on the national debt, the debt that's piled up and up and up. That interest is the third largest function in our government, and it's second only to the government's cost of the Soviet Union in being higher than the cost of any government operation in this world. Defense is first, entitlements are second, and then interest on the national debt. And if we could get the deficit beginning to come under control and get those interest rates down, cut the interest rates in half, Doctor, which could happen if we got the deficit under control, we'd all of a sudden take 60, 65 billion, 70 billion out of that function of government spending. So a lot hinges on not worrying about the crosswalks, but developing among the general American public the demand for doing it. Congress isn't going to get off its bloody duff until the American people demand they do it. And the American people aren't going to demand that they stop the spending and stop the cutting of taxes, which the American people always favor, until they realize that they're the ones that are having to pay, and they're paying in a lot of different ways. Alan Greenspan said a week or so ago that 15 million families in this country spend 50% of their disposable income to service their debt. That's a tremendous whammy.
That's a lot of debt. Congressman Rhodes, would you like to comment on that?
Yes, I'd like to comment on the general question, which I think also had to do with the, I think the term was waltzing around the federal deficit, and I sort of interpreted that as wonderment that the Congress has such a hard time in adopting a budget resolution. And having been on the original committee which put this congressional budget together, and incidentally, the smartest thing we ever did was to hire Alice Rivlin to the Congressional Budget Office. I have some feelings about that. I think that we made several mistakes, but we had to because we had to get the votes to get the budget system through the Congress. One of the mistakes was that we didn't make it necessary for something to happen on May 15th. May 15th was the date upon which Congress was to have had a budget resolution in place. Well, since we didn't make it necessary, nothing did happen for years. My idea at the time, and I still think that it ought to be considered, is that something must happen on May 15th. Now, how do you get a future Congress to do something that they don't have to do because they could repeal a law. Well, the main way to do that is to make it absolutely unthinkable for the situation to occur, which would occur if they don't act. In other words, it has to be a reverse aim and motive rather than a positive one. And I suggest that if on May 15th, if the Congress doesn't have a budget resolution in place, that the President's budget as submitted in January then becomes the Congressional budget. That would be a result which absolutely nobody in the Congress would want. And that then there would probably be the impetus and the incentive for Congress to act on May 15th. Now, why do they have to? Because if they don't, there are certain legislative actions which need to be taken, such as authorizing new legislation, such as getting appropriations bills underway, which don't occur and can't occur until the first concurrent budget resolution is adopted. I say can't, and I shouldn't say that because you can do things, especially in the House. If the Rules Committee wants to bring out a piece of legislation waiving points of order, you can do anything. But that shouldn't happen. So I would suggest, Mark, that there are an awful lot of things that we need to do to the structure itself. But before I quit, let me say that the committee, which I represent, the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget, is not really united on feeling that there is that you ought to take something, have something to do with the system first. It's often said in our meetings that the problem is the problem. In other words, the budget, the deficit is the problem. You deal with that, but I submit as an individual that since this deficit isn't going to go away overnight, that you have to pay some attention to the process too. And I think the process, as we now know it, is seriously faulted.
Thank you very much. Mark Andrews, following up with Congressman Rhodes' comments, one of the questioners has again started with a statement saying that why can't we put a blowtorch to congressmen's feet and get them to move? And what they're referring to is that the last session of Congress, the 99th Congress, not one appropriations bill was passed. As you know, we have a tradition in the Congress to pile everything up like a schoolboy that you just referred to and cram at the last minute, and we have this enormous big appropriations bill that suddenly gets passed. Mark Andrews, with all your experience in the Congress, what can be done about that?
Well, again, very little until the public perception begins to zero in on how Congress is sliding, and ducking around what needs to be done.
Well, I would suggest, though, the weapon that he suggested was a blowtorch, so he or she must have been pretty aggravated. Do you think that will spread across the country?
Well, hopefully, but we've got a budget committee that has been put into place. I was a member of the budget committee, but the budget committee has substituted a third group of members, a third committee, to take part in the annual authorizing and/or appropriation process. A decade ago, you had the Appropriations Committee and the Authorizing Committee. The Appropriations Committee largely set funding level, spending level for each year. Now you've got the Budget Committee, and the Appropriation Committee has to wait until the Budget Committee finishes its act. Not just until the Budget Committee finishes its act, but until the body finishes acting on the budget resolution. And we're like a bunch of school kids. You know, if we can do something and get a star on that chart alongside of our name and gain the approbation of the teachers, we just look for a quick way to get that done. And if you can vote yes on some inane amendment to a budget resolution and then put out an immediate press release that, by gosh, I really saved an awful lot of money and I took a step toward reducing the deficit, you can cast 17 other votes negating that one good one, and you're home free. And that's why I said